Have you ever wondered why all over the world, from Rome to St. Petersburg, from Alexandria to Paris, we see these strange solitary giants? Enormous, perfectly polished stone pillars reaching toward the sky, with nothing attached to them. Historians smile and calmly explain that these are merely monuments, triumphal columns, tributes to emperors, generals, and long-forgotten gods. But let me ask you one simple question, one that instantly shatters this cozy academic fairy tale. Why build an extraordinarily complex engineering structure weighing hundreds of tons if it serves no functional purpose at all? We are being lied to blatantly and directly. And the scale of this lie is so vast that the average person is simply afraid to accept it. Official history starts to fall apart the moment you take out a ruler and a calculator. Today, we're going to pull the curtain back on one of the most uncomfortable secrets of our civilization. We're going to talk about solitary columns. And trust me, after this video, you will never look at the Alexander Column or Pompey's Column the same way again. You will no longer see a monument. You will see a piece of technical equipment, or the remnant of something so colossal that our minds refuse to process it. Let's start with the facts that are right in front of us, the ones we've trained ourselves to ignore. Take, for example, the Jewel of St. Petersburg, the Alexander Column. We're told it was erected in 1834. Architect Auguste de Montferrand supposedly used a brilliant system of wooden scaffolding, ropes, and the sheer muscle power of thousands of soldiers. Sounds heroic, doesn't it? Now let's turn on our brains and look at the cold numbers and at basic material science. The shaft of the column weighs over 600 tons. It's a monolith, a single, solid piece of granite. Do you have any idea what 600 tons actually means? That's the weight of 10 modern freight railcars fully loaded with coal, or 3 massive Boeing 747 passenger jets. And we're expected to believe that this colossus was moved on wooden rollers, pulled by hemp ropes. Engineers and builders who work with modern heavy machinery know that lifting even a 100-ton load is an extremely complex operation requiring hydraulics, steel cables, and computer-calculated load distributions. And here we're shown drawings from Montferrand's album where little stick figure men cheerfully tug on ropes. That's not technical documentation. It's a comic book for naive children. If we actually calculate the coefficient of friction, the tensile strength of hemp rope, and the force required, we find that the number of people needed to lift such a monolith would be physically impossible to fit on Palace Square. They would simply crush each other. But the most interesting part isn't even the lifting. The most interesting part is the processing. Walk right up to any of these columns. Look closely at the surface. Look at the quality of the polish. It's a perfect mirror-like gloss. Granite is one of the hardest materials on Earth. To achieve a surface like this by hand would require decades of labor. Entire teams of stoneworkers endlessly rubbing the stone with sand and water. But what we see is not merely smooth stone. What we see is perfect geometry, a flawless cylinder or cone with an impeccable radius. Any machinist will tell you that a body of revolution like this can be created in only one way, by rotating the workpiece. Do you hear what I'm saying? By rotating a workpiece that weighs 600 tons. That means the builders, whoever they really were, had access to lathe machines of truly cyclopean scale. Not chisels and hammers, but industrial machinery operating with carbide cutting tools and enormous rotational speeds. The traces of this machine processing are visible to the naked eye, if you know where to look. Yet historians stubbornly keep repeating the fairy tale about manual labor performed by serfs. This lie becomes even more obvious when we look at geography. The exact same columns stand in Baalbek, in Egypt, in Rome. Pompey's Column in Alexandria is another red granite monolith, weighing nearly 300 tons. And once again, the same story. Not a single document. Not a single technical drawing of real mechanisms. Only myths and legends about how primitive people in sandals supposedly accomplished all of this. Official chronology scatters these structures across thousands of years. We're told the Romans built one thing, the Egyptians another, and that the Russian Empire merely imitated antiquity. But the technical signature is identical everywhere. This is a single standard, a unified specification, a global GOSD, if you like. Identical proportions, identical material, identical traces of machine processing. This tells us that these objects were created by one and the same civilization, one that possessed a global infrastructure and technologies that surpass even our modern capabilities. So why do they stand alone? Why is nothing attached to them? Why are their tops so often crowned with tiny, completely disproportionate statues of angels or saints that look like foreign objects? The answer suggests itself. The statues were added later. Much later. Those who came upon the ruins of the old world found these gigantic pillars and, not understanding their original purpose, decided to use them as pedestals for their new idols. This is cargo cult behavior in its purest form. Like savages, we stumbled upon the remnants of a high-tech civilization and adapted them to our primitive needs, declaring them monuments of victory. But remove the statues, what do we see? We see perfectly straight, polished rods piercing the sky. Some researchers point out that many columns are hollow inside or contain metal rods running through the entire structure. Take Trajan's column in Rome, for example. Inside it is a spiral staircase carved directly into the stone. Think about the sheer complexity of this work, cutting a perfect helix inside marble blocks and fitting them together with millimeter-level precision. That level of accuracy today is achievable only with CNC machines. Why go to such extremes for a monument? Why make it functional on the inside if the outside is supposedly just decoration? We are standing on the threshold of a terrifying discovery. These columns were never monuments. They were part of a gigantic technical network that once spanned the entire planet. Perhaps these columns were supports for something that was later destroyed. Or perhaps they were devices in their own right: generators, transmitters, atmospheric condensers. We're used to thinking that electricity was discovered in the 19th century. But what if we simply rediscovered something that humanity already possessed thousands of years ago? What if these granite spires are the remnants of a unified energy system of the past, a system that we, in our ignorance, now label as temples and monuments? Take a closer look at granite itself. It contains crystalline quartz, a material with piezoelectric properties. When compressed, it generates an electric charge. 600 tons of granite create enormous internal pressure. This is not just stone. It is a massive battery positioned at strictly defined geodetic points across the Earth. Official science is terrified of these questions, because the moment you admit that the Alexander Column could not have been made by hand, you are forced to rewrite the entire history of the 19th century. You would have to admit that there was no backward, Bash-wearing Russia, but rather a territory possessing extremely advanced technologies that then vanished suddenly and without explanation. Where did the machines go? Where did the craftsmen go? Why was the technological chain broken? The answer lies in demographic collapses and strange inconsistencies in population censuses, something we'll talk about a little later. For now, fix this fact firmly in your mind. Solitary columns are markers of deception. They are physical evidence of another history, one that has been carefully erased. And the deeper we dig, the more disturbing the picture becomes. We've only just begun dismantling this foundation of lies. And believe me, beneath it lie the ruins of our real past. Now let's dive into the technical details, the kind that make the hair on the back of any properly trained engineer's neck start to move. If we discard the fairy tales told by tour guides and open textbooks on material strength and logistics, the official version of how the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral, or the Alexander Column itself, were constructed collapses into dust. We're told that the granite was quarried in Piter Laxa, cut by hand, loaded onto wooden barges, and transported to St. Petersburg. It sounds like a plan, until you start doing the math. Each column of St. Isaac's Cathedral weighs 114 tons, and there are 112 of them. Do you grasp the scale of that logistical operation? In the early 19th century, there were no railroads capable of bearing such loads, and no paved highways. The roads of that era were compacted dirt, turning into impassable mud after the first rain. Try hauling a 100-ton load on a cart across wet clay. The wheels would sink into the ground up to the axle almost instantly. Physics cannot be cheated. The ground pressure from such a load is enormous. To move weights like this, you need a specially prepared route with a concrete foundation, something that, according to official history, simply did not exist at the time. Now look at the stone itself. Official science insists that all these columns were carved from natural rock. But alternative researchers conducting macrophotography of the surfaces are finding strange anomalies. inclusions that look like air bubbles frozen inside the mass. A layered structure resembling concrete poured in stages. More and more evidence suggests that what we're dealing with is not natural granite at all, but high-quality geopolymer concrete, an artificial stone technology known to the ancients and only now being rediscovered by us. This explains everything. The perfect geometry, the absence of chisel marks, the ability to create gigantic monoliths. They weren't hauled across vast distances. They were cast right on site, in formwork, just like we pour monolithic skyscrapers today. But to admit this is to admit that chemistry and materials science in the past were at least on par with, if not superior to, our own. So who gave these formulas to 19th century architects? Or, more likely, were these columns already standing there for centuries, with Montferrand and his team merely restoring and clearing them? Look closely at engravings from that era. For example, the works of Piranesi. Historians dismiss him as a fantasist, a visionary artist who drew imaginary ruins. But then why are his fantasies so photographically precise? In Piranesi's engravings, we see gigantic structures overgrown with trees, half buried in earth, among which small, ragged figures wander. These people are clearly not builders. They are inhabitants of ruins. They light campfires at the bases of cyclopean columns, using fragments of majestic architecture as furniture. This is a post-apocalyptic image, a picture of a world that has survived a global catastrophe. And these solitary columns scattered across the planet are the framework of that dead world, the skeleton of a colossal, planetary-scale structure whose walls were swept away by cataclysm. Now let's move to Baalbek, in modern-day Lebanon. There, at the base of the Temple of Jupiter, lie the famous trilithons, stone blocks weighing 800, sometimes even 1,000 tons each. Official history attributes them to the Romans. The Romans, the very same people whose most advanced lifting technology was a wooden polyspast crane, capable of raising maybe 5 or 6 tons. Do you feel the monstrous gap between reality and what's written in textbooks? To lift 1,000 tons today, you need paired Liebherr crawler cranes, each the size of a house. And we're told the Romans did it with ropes and pulleys. This isn't even funny. It's an insult to our intelligence. What's more, the quarry is located below the level of the temple. That means these stones didn't just have to be dragged, they had to be dragged uphill. What was the coefficient of friction? What was the required pulling force? If you try to calculate how many people would be needed just to get such a block moving, you end up with a crowd stretching for kilometers. Commanding such a mass of people is impossible. Synchronizing their effort is impossible. And this brings us to the key question. Why this obsession with gigantism? Why not build with bricks or small blocks, like normal people do? Why deliberately create unbearable engineering challenges? The answer is simple and terrifying. For those who built this, it wasn't difficult. It was standard. For them, working with 1,000-ton weights was as routine as laying aerated concrete blocks is for us. That means gravity was not a problem for them. Either they possessed machines of unimaginable power or technologies for controlling weight, anti-gravity, acoustic levitation, call it whatever you want. But it wasn't us. And it certainly wasn't sandal-wearing Romans. Now look at how these structures are actually used. In Baalbek, in Egypt, in Rome, crude walls of rough, unworked stone or clay are often tacked onto these gigantic columns. That is the real handiwork of the civilizations we're taught about in school. They came to something already built. They settled among the ruins. They patched together their huts between the great pillars of the past. That is why the columns stand alone. Everything that once surrounded them, everything built by that great civilization, was destroyed. Only the strongest, most fundamental elements remained, the load-bearing supports. We live in a world of reuse. We are a scavenger civilization that appropriated the achievements of gods and called them our own history. So why do scientists stay silent? Why is anyone who mentions geopolymer concrete or the impossibility of hand-carving granite immediately labeled a pseudoscientist? Because what's at stake isn't just the dating of a temple or a monument. What's at stake is the legitimacy of modern power and of the entire system of knowledge. If we admit that a more advanced civilization existed before us and that it was wiped out in an instant, an unavoidable question arises. What destroyed it? And could it happen again? And most importantly, who rules the world today while hiding the truth about our origins. Perhaps we are not the pinnacle of evolution, as Darwin taught us, but the degraded descendants of survivors. Or worse, a new population artificially planted on a cleansed territory. Take a look at 18th century maps. On those maps, there are cities that no longer exist. There are rivers flowing in entirely different directions. The geography of the past does not match the geography of the present. That tells us the planet's terrain changed very recently. And the solitary columns are geodetic markers, beacons that survive this chaos of planetary reconfiguration. Now let's turn to the most terrifying evidence of all, not geology, not material science, but dry statistics and demography. These are the numbers historians hate more than anything else. We're shown grand images of 19th century empires, explosive growth, massive construction projects, a golden age of art and architecture. But when we open the actual demographic reports of that era, we see emptiness, a mathematical impossibility. Take mid-19th century St. Petersburg or Paris. We're told that hundreds of thousands of workers built these cities. But population figures from those years simply do not match the claimed scale of construction. To build something like St. Isaac's Cathedral or the U.S. Capitol with the technologies of that time would require a superpower economy and an army of skilled craftsmen. People who would need to be fed, clothed, housed, and trained for decades. Instead, we're shown a world where 90% of the population consists of illiterate peasants surviving on subsistence farming. So where did the resources come from? This is an economic paradox. Imagine a modern third-world country with no roads and no electricity suddenly deciding to build a spaceport on the scale of Cape Canaveral, using nothing but hose and wheelbarrows. It's absurd. Yet that is exactly what we're being asked to believe. And here we arrive at a phenomenon alternative researchers call the empty cities effect. Look at the earliest daguerreotypes and photographs from the 1850s and 1860s. Paris, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Rome, vast boulevards, monumental buildings, and almost no people. Ghost cities. Rare, solitary figures appear lost against the backdrop of cyclopean scenery. Historians explain this away. Long exposure times, people blurred and vanished. But the water in the rivers is sharp. The shadows from trees are crisp. And the crowds that should have been swarming the capitals of great empires have vanished without a trace. No, this is not exposure time. This is the recording of a moment of settlement. We are seeing the world immediately after a reset. Those who survived, or those who were brought here, are entering empty cities left behind by giants. And here the solitary columns finally reveal their true meaning. These are not monuments. They are surviving fragments of infrastructure, structures that were simply too strong to be destroyed by the catastrophe we euphemistically call the mud flood or mud flood. Look at the bases of these columns. Very often, archaeological excavations reveal that what we think of as ground level is actually a layer of sediment several meters thick. The columns extend deep downward. They have no foundation in the conventional sense. They are simply buried under soil, clay, and sand. The Roman Forum was excavated from beneath multi-meter layers of earth. The Polytechnic Museum in Moscow, buildings in Kazan and Omsk. Everywhere we see buried floors, windows, and doorways disappearing underground. We're told this is how they built back then, that it's a cultural layer. Seriously? A cultural layer is trash accumulating over centuries. This is entire first floors buried in clay. These are traces of a planetary-scale mud flow, a wave that swept across continents, carrying millions of tons of earth, destroying fragile structures, but unable to topple these granite shafts. The solitary columns are trees in a stone forest that survived a tsunami. Everything else was washed away. And the new masters of life who came to these ruins simply cleared the areas around them, called them squares, and invented elegant legends about their construction. Now look at the ergonomics. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable point for the official narrative. The height of steps in ancient temples, the dimensions of doorways, the handles on the doors of old cathedrals that an average person cannot even reach. These buildings, of which our solitary columns were once a part, were not built for us. They were built for beings 3 to 4 meters tall. We look like children wearing their father's shoes in these settings. We are Lilliputians in the land of giants. All these massive arches, soaring ceilings, enormous windows. This is not architectural bravado. It is functional necessity for those who live there. So where did they go? Why are only we left? Here we enter the territory of the darkest hypothesis of all. Perhaps the history of humanity is a history of artificial selection. Recall the enormous number of orphanages and foundling homes in the 19th century. Children appeared by the thousands, without parents, without a past. They were educated from scratch, given new surnames, taught anew, invented history. As a population, we may have been restored from test tubes or incubators after the previous civilization was wiped out. We are the second shift on this planet, and we were given a simplified version of reality so that we wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. The solitary columns stand as silent witnesses to this crime. Nothing is attached to them because all the floors, roofs, and walls were destroyed. What we see is only the skeleton. Imagine a modern skyscraper stripped of all its cladding, glass, and interior walls, leaving only the load-bearing concrete pillars. 1,000 years later, savages find these pillars and worship them as phallic symbols of the gods. That is exactly what we are doing today. We walk around technical installations called the Alexandrian Column or Trajan's Column, without even suspecting that we are standing in the middle of a gigantic ruined power plant or factory. The thought is terrifying. It makes you feel like a grain of sand, deceived, abandoned, insignificant. But it also provides the key to understanding. If we accept the fact of a catastrophe, the fact of population replacement and technological loss, then all the inconsistencies of history vanish instantly. It becomes clear why we cannot reproduce polygonal masonry, why we no longer know how to make such bricks, why we cannot cast a granite vase like those in museums. We didn't forget how to do these things. We never knew how. They did, those who came before us, and whose legacy we are now exploiting so clumsily. But the most intriguing part is this: the technologies of the past did not disappear without a trace. They are encoded in the architecture itself. Take a world map and mark the locations of these monumental solitary columns. Then connect them with lines, and a chill will run down your spine. This is not a random distribution of monuments. It is a precisely calibrated geometric grid. The lines cross continents and oceans, forming perfect triangles and polygons. Telecommunications engineers, looking at this pattern, immediately recognize the topology of a cellular network or a signal distribution system. These stone needles are driven into the body of the planet at strictly defined nodal points. This is the acupuncture of the Earth. It is the nervous system of a gigantic organism that once pulsed with energy and is now dead. We've reached the most dangerous part of our investigation: the answer to the question of what these columns actually did. Remember Nikola Tesla, the genius who claimed that energy could be transmitted wirelessly over any distance. He built his towers at Wardenclyffe, which are suspiciously similar in principle to our granite monoliths. Tesla wasn't inventing anything new. He was trying to resurrect a forgotten technology of the past, a technology for harvesting atmospheric electricity. Granite, saturated with quartz and compressed under its own colossal weight, becomes a piezoelectric generator. The metal finials that we now mistake for crosses or statues of angels were originally receivers or emitters, resonators. The entire planet was once covered by a dome of free, clean, infinite energy. Imagine a world where there is no need to burn oil or coal, where light and heat are available anywhere on Earth simply by birthright, where flying machines, the very Vimanas described in ancient texts, glide through the sky, repelled by the electromagnetic field generated by these columns. That was a golden age. That was paradise. And it was taken from us. Why? Because free people cannot be controlled. If you have heat, light, and the ability to move freely, you are independent. You are not a slave to the system. To turn us into an obedient herd, the first step was to pull the switch, destroy the towers, remove the resonators, and then, once generational memory had faded, hand us electricity meters and hook us on oil. We pay money for what our ancestors took straight from the air. This is the greatest scam in the history of existence. But shutting down this system did not go without consequences. There is a theory, one that makes your blood run cold, that the global catastrophe, the so-called mud flood and the buried cities, was the result of an overload of this energy system. Perhaps there was a conflict, a war of gods. Someone decided to use the network as a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. Recall the strange Great Fires of the 19th century: Chicago, Boston, Moscow. Entire cities burned to the ground, and the fire melted brick and stone, turning them into glass. An ordinary fire cannot reach such temperatures. These are traces of plasmavoyistvi, directed energy strikes. The columns survived because they were part of the circuit. They were grounded. Everything around them was reduced to dust and ash. That dust later fell with rain, covering the planet with meters of mud. And we, the survivors, or those newly created, crawl across this dirt, dig out the first floors of palaces, and wonder how our ancestors managed to build such beautiful basements with windows. We live on the graveyard of a great civilization, using its tombstones as tourist attractions. We look at the Alexander Column and fail to see that it is a de-energized induction coil. We are a cargo cult, worshipping a broken airplane that will never fly again. This realization provokes rage. We were not just deceived, we were reduced to the status of livestock. Look at the architecture of modern human hives, concrete boxes we live in. Compare them to ancient palaces with 5-meter ceilings. Do you feel the difference in how humans were valued? Back then, a human was a creator, equal to the gods. Today, a human is an economic unit, a battery, a resource. Those who seized power after the catastrophe rewrote history. They invented the Scaliger chronology. They stretched centuries, divided a single world into warring states so that we would never unite and restore what was lost. Divide and rule. That principle has worked flawlessly for centuries. And the solitary columns stand as a silent accusation. They are the one thing the usurpers could not destroy or hide. They are too enormous, too visible. So they were hidden in plain sight, renamed monuments. Legends were invented about Montferrand and Roman emperors. Technology was concealed behind the facade of art. It's a brilliant move. If you want to hide something, put it in the open. We walk past, take selfies, and have no idea that our hands are touching the casing of a reactor or an intercontinental communications antenna. And here another terrifying thought emerges. What if they were never fully shut down? What if they are simply in standby mode? What if these granite rods are still emitting certain frequencies that affect our consciousness, suppressing will, lowering cognitive ability, turning us into passive consumers? Granite vibrations, sacred geometry, resonant forms, all of its psychotronic influence. We are living inside a gigantic machine, one that may be keeping us in this half-asleep state, preventing us from waking up and recognizing reality. We are prisoners without bars. And these beautiful columns are the bars of our mental cage. But any knowledge is the first step toward freedom. The moment you begin to see a column not as a monument, but as a technical device, the spell breaks. The matrix glitches. You stop being a compliant element of the system and become a researcher. You begin to ask questions. And questions are the most dangerous weapon against lies.